A vanished set of sketches, a hidden truth in smudged ink, and a village secret no one dares to speak. Are you ready to uncover it? Light a candle, settle in, and let the mystery begin. It was a June afternoon in St. Mary Mead, the kind of afternoon when the sky seemed to lower itself gently over the gardens, and the scent of roses hung heavily in the warm air. The vicarage lawn was dotted with wicker chairs and white-clothed tables where teapots gleamed and plates of sponge cakes threatened to vanish under eager forks. It was the annual charity garden party, a tradition so well worn that no one could recall when it had first begun. Miss Marple sat beneath a striped parasol, her knitting needles resting in her lap. She had taken the shade not because of discomfort, but because one could see rather a lot from the corner seat, who lingered at the cake table, who whispered in whose ear, and who pretended not to notice another's presence. It was precisely the sort of event that delighted her curiosity, for human nature revealed itself most freely at leisure. Among the guests, the most remarked upon was Mr. Lionel Querrin, a recently arrived artist of some notoriety. His tall, angular figure and carefully disheveled hair made him look the part of the creative genius, and he had brought with him a reputation for painting portraits both flattering and merciless. He carried, tucked under his arm, a leather-bound sketchbook which, he told anyone who asked, contained preliminary studies for a commission. His smile suggested mystery, though it was just enough to seem deliberate. "It is odd," whispered Mrs. Price Ridley to her neighbor, adjusting her hat, "how a man can make a living drawing faces when he barely remembers to wash his own." She sniffed in disapproval, though her eyes never strayed far from the sketchbook. Not far off, young Lydia Crane, daughter of the local doctor, seemed in unusually high spirits, laughing rather more loudly than custom allowed. Her father frowned at her, but she paid him no heed, drifting closer and closer to Mr. Querrin. Some said she had artistic leanings of her own, others, less charitably, suggested she was smitten with the newcomer. The afternoon unfolded with the usual raffles, polite applause, and rustling of teacups, until suddenly a ripple of unease spread across the gathering. Mrs. Bantry, bustling toward the refreshment table, gave a sharp cry. On the grass lay Mr. Querrin's sketchbook, its cover bent as though torn from his grasp. He himself was nowhere to be seen. At first, it was thought he had merely wandered off, but when a search of the vicarage grounds failed to uncover him, worry set in. The sketchbook, now opened in curious hands, revealed several quick but startling studies of the very people gathered at the party. Some were flattering, others seemed almost cruel in their sharp observation. More disturbing still was one unfinished drawing, a figure slumped in a chair, head bowed, unnaturally, with a dark smear across the page where the pencil had broken. Whispers began at once. Was it an artistic fancy or something more sinister? Miss Hartnell muttered that it looked like a premonition of death. Mr. Clement, the vicar, tried to hush the crowd, but speculation had already taken root. Miss Marple, meanwhile, leaned forward, peering at the page with mild interest. "How very curious," she murmured, almost to herself. She noted the position of the torn paper fibers, the smudge of graphite on the artist's cuff when he had last lifted his teacup, and the peculiar absence of one of the sketches. An entire sheet had been cleanly removed. It was not until the church clock chimed 5 that the true shock arrived. A shout came from the far end of the vicarage orchard. Villagers rushed to the spot, only to find Lionel Querrin himself lying lifeless in the grass, a broken teacup beside him. His expression was strangely serene, as though he had expected the moment. The garden party dissolved into chaos. Lydia Crane screamed as Mrs. Price Ridley crossed herself with unnecessary vigor, and Dr. Crane bent to examine the body, his face paling even as he shook his head. "Poison," he whispered darkly, though how and why remained unanswered. Miss Marple, still at her seat, watched the commotion with steady eyes. In her experience, people always revealed themselves most clearly in the first moments after calamity. Already she could see who moved forward to help, who shrank back, and who seemed more preoccupied with the sketchbook than the man who had drawn it. Somewhere in that orchard lay the beginning of an answer. And Miss Marple, with her quiet certainty, knew that the obscured sketchbook would not be the only thing hiding secrets in St. Mary Mead. The discovery of Mr. Lionel Quarren's body sent the quiet rhythm of St. Mary Mead into a state of agitation not seen since the war years. News travelled faster than the constable's bicycle could carry him, for every witness at the vicarage garden party seemed to feel it a solemn duty to report their own version of events. By evening, the entire village had formed opinions, suspicions, and theories, all conflicting, all delivered with the authority of absolute certainty. At the Blue Boar Inn, Mr. Tompkins, the landlord, leaned across the counter to confide to a group of eager listeners that the artist had been a bit too full of himself. He insisted he had seen Quarren arguing with someone only 2 days prior, though, when pressed for the details, he admitted he had not been close enough to hear what was said. "But you could tell," he declared, polishing a glass with righteous vigor by the way the fellow waved his arms about. "Men don't wave their arms unless they're hiding something." His audience nodded gravely, as though this were irrefutable evidence. Meanwhile, at Mrs. Price Ridley's drawing room, the tone was altogether different. She had gathered her usual circle, Miss Hartnell, Mrs. Bantry, and 2 or 3 other ladies who could be trusted to repeat whatever they heard with suitable emphasis. With her voice lowered to a whisper, she announced that the sketches found in Quarren's book were nothing less than scandalous. Imagine my own likeness, with my hat drawn askew as though I had drunk too much sherry. Such malice cannot be dismissed. It is clear to me that the poor man had made enemies everywhere. Miss Hartnell, never one to resist an argument, countered that artists were often misunderstood. It may only have been a caricature. Still, if one has enemies, one must take care. Poison does not pour itself into teacups. She tapped her knitting needles together for emphasis, the sound as sharp as her words. Dr. Haydock, summoned at once after the discovery, moved through the village with uncharacteristic briskness. To Mrs. Bantry, he remarked that the man had shown no sign of illness, which made the suddenness of his collapse all the more suspicious. To the constable, he spoke in sterner tones, advising that the remains of the teacup be carefully preserved. It was plain that the idea of poison had taken firm hold of his mind. Through all this, Miss Marple remained in her little cottage on the lane, where she poured herself a quiet cup of tea and reflected. She had listened attentively to the rumors that floated through the open windows and drifted across garden fences. People underestimated how much information could be gleaned simply by allowing others to chatter unchecked. In her experience, truth often slipped into the cracks between exaggeration and gossip. The constable, earnest young Pritchard, called upon her the next morning, cap in hand and expression troubled. "It's all quite beyond me, Miss Marple. They've sent word for Inspector Craddock, but until he arrives, it falls to me to keep order, and orders are in short supply just now." He paused, looking almost embarrassed. "It seems everyone has something to say about the man. Never knew him myself, but you'd think half the village had quarrelled with him." Miss Marple gave a sympathetic nod, her hands folded neatly. "Artists do have a way of making observations that can sting, Constable. People rarely mind the truth unless it concerns themselves." He shifted awkwardly. "There's talk, you see. Some say he was paying too much attention to Dr. Crane's daughter. Others mention quarrels over money. And then there's the matter of the missing page from that sketchbook. No one can say what it contained." "Missing pages are often more telling than the ones that remain," Miss Marple said gently. "But I dare say Inspector Craddock will have the experience to untangle it all. In the meantime, it would be wise to listen more than you speak. Villagers will tell you a good deal if you let them." That advice proved accurate, for by mid-morning, theories had multiplied like weeds in an untended garden. At the grocer's, it was confidently asserted that Lydia Crane must have been because her infatuation with Quarren had been plain to anyone with eyes. In the churchyard, old Mr. Pottle declared he had seen the artist sketching gravestones and muttered that no good could come from such morbid habits. At the post office, Miss Weatherby leaned across the counter to assure Mrs. Bantry that she had once seen Querin receive a letter in a foreign hand, and that nothing decent ever came from abroad. Each rumour, Miss Marple observed, told her more about the speaker than about the victim. The villagers revealed their prejudices, their jealousies, their hidden grievances, all of which were useful in their way. By the afternoon, Inspector Craddock arrived, striding into St. Mary Mead with his usual air of brisk competence. He was a tall man with a sharp manner that often concealed genuine respect for Miss Marple's insights. The constable was plainly relieved to hand over responsibility. Craddock wasted no time in examining the orchard where Querin had been found, his eyes lingering on the broken teacup. "The doctor believes poison," he remarked when Miss Marple happened upon the scene. "It will take time to confirm. In the meantime, I must ask questions, though I doubt I'll get many straight answers in a place like this." "People in villages rarely tell the truth directly," Miss Marple replied with a faint smile. "But they often reveal more than they intend if one is patient enough to listen." Craddock gave her a quick glance, half amusement, half acknowledgement. "Then perhaps you will do some listening for me, Miss Marple. Quietly, of course." And so it was that the wheels of inquiry began to turn, not in the police station, but in the parlours, kitchens, and gardens of St. Mary Mead. Suspicion pointed first one way, then another, like a weathercock spinning in a restless wind. Each villager sought to protect their own reputation, to distance themselves from the death, and in so doing they revealed slivers of truth Miss Marple alone could fit together. As the sun dipped low over the thatched rooftops, the village seemed outwardly unchanged. Children played in the lanes, hens clucked in tidy yards, and the church bell tolled the evening hour. Yet beneath the surface, St. Mary Mead was restless. For the first time in many years, the people felt a shadow among them not just of death, but of suspicion, and Miss Marple, knitting quietly by her window, reflected that nothing tested human character so completely as fear of exposure. She had seen it before, and she knew she would see it again. The question was not only who had killed Lionel Querin, but what secret they feared would be revealed in the telling. Inspector Craddock wasted no time in establishing a base of operations. By mid-morning, he had installed himself in the vicar's study, a room filled with heavy books and the faint scent of polish. Constable Pritchard sat at a small side table, his notebook open, though his eyes betrayed his anxiety at keeping pace with the inspector's clipped questions. Outside, the garden remained a stage for whispers and furtive glances, the villagers passing by on one errand or another, each slowing to peer at the vicarage as though it might yield answers if stared at long enough. The inspector began with those who had been closest to the scene. Dr. Crane was summoned first, his expression grave, his manner professional yet faintly defensive. He explained with a physician's precision that Querin's collapse had been sudden, with no outward sign of illness beforehand. "Poison, yes," he said, stroking his chin, though the method will require proper analysis. "The residue on the broken cup is consistent with something bitter, though bitterness may be masked in tea if properly sweetened." Craddock's pencil moved briskly, and the man had enemies. Dr. Crane hesitated, then glanced toward the door as though to ensure his daughter was not within earshot. "He was a man of charm, Inspector, but charm of a kind that can unsettle." He encouraged attention. "My daughter, Lydia, admired him perhaps too openly, though she is young. I cannot say I approved." His lips tightened. "Such men often leave hurt behind them. That can create enemies." When Lydia herself was called, her manner was altogether different, bright, defensive, and tinged with indignation. She admitted to enjoying Querin's company, to sitting for him once or twice while he sketched. "He was kind to me," she insisted, her eyes flashing. "Far kinder than most here, who see nothing in a girl beyond what she is expected to be." When Craddock pressed her about the sketches, particularly the missing page, her cheeks flushed. "I don't know anything about it." Perhaps he threw it away. He was particular about his work. She left the room with her head high, though her trembling hands betrayed her distress. Miss Marple, who had been invited to sit quietly by the vicar's bookcase, observed it all without comment. She noted the way Lydia had spoken of kindness, as though it were a rare coin, and how her father's anger stemmed not only from concern, but from wounded pride. Human emotions, Miss Marple reflected, were like the patterns in her knitting. One dropped stitch could unravel far more than expected. Next came Mrs. Price Ridley, sweeping into the study with the air of a woman prepared to deliver a full testimony, whether asked or not. She described in detail how the sketchbook had been found, how the figures within were drawn with cruel accuracy. Why, Inspector, I myself was portrayed in a most unbecoming light, with a tilt to my hat that suggested inebriation. Malicious, I assure you. It is clear to me that the man sought to insult and provoke. She sniffed. I warned others that no good would come of encouraging him. Artists live disordered lives. Craddock listened patiently, then inquired about her movements during the party. Mrs. Price Ridley declared she had been no more than a few steps from the refreshment table when the commotion began. I had just selected a slice of seed cake, she added with unnecessary precision, and can provide witnesses to confirm it. She looked triumphant, as though establishing an alibi in advance. After her came Mrs. Bantry, whose account was delivered with less venom but equal detail. She described how she had heard a commotion, turned, and seen the sketchbook lying open on the grass. It seemed such a curious thing, she mused, as though it had been deliberately dropped. And that missing page, Inspector, struck me at once. An artist does not tear out his work without reason. Craddock made a note, his brow furrowing. And yet no one admits to having seen the page. No one admits, perhaps, Miss Marple said softly from her corner. But people are often more honest in what they avoid saying. Craddock glanced at her, amused despite himself. And what, Miss Marple, do you believe they are avoiding? She gave a mild smile. It is only an impression. One learns in a village that silence can be as eloquent as speech, but I would not wish to prejudice the investigation. Craddock let the matter drop, though he scribbled a note in the margin of his pad. He had learned long ago that Miss Marple's impressions were rarely without value. By afternoon, the artist's lodgings were examined. He had taken rooms at Mrs. Cleet's boarding house, a narrow dwelling with polished banisters and curtains too heavy for the season. Mrs. Cleet, red-faced and indignant, declared that her tenant had been quiet, paid promptly, and left no disorder behind. He was an odd one, to be sure, scribbling at all hours. But I saw nothing improper. In his small room, however, Craddock found further sketches, faces again, this time less detailed, more hurried, as though captured in moments of passing observation. Among them were unmistakable likenesses of Lydia Crane, Mrs. Price Ridley, and even Dr. Haydock, drawn with the same unflinching accuracy. More curious still, one sheet lay crumpled in the wastebasket, a partial drawing of a hand holding a goblet, the lines smudged as though rubbed out in haste. Constable Pritchard looked puzzled. "Do you think it was practice, sir?" Craddock shook his head. Or perhaps something he decided he should not keep. Either way, it adds to the mystery. Miss Marple, who had accompanied them with the gentle pretext of lending a woman's eye, quietly examined the discarded paper. Her gaze lingered not on the hand, but on the faint impression left on the sheet beneath it, a ghostly outline that suggested a face, though too blurred to make out. She said nothing, slipping the observation into the back of her mind as she might have a loose thread to be picked up later. The day concluded with an uneasy sense of incompleteness. A man was dead, a sketchbook missing a page, and a village buzzing with speculation. The inspector, though diligent, had yet to find a clear path through the thicket of gossip and grievance. Each interview raised new questions. Who had the opportunity to poison the tea? What had become of the missing drawing, and why had the artist chosen to depict his neighbors in such unflattering, even cruel ways? As dusk fell over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by her window once more, knitting needles clicking softly. To a casual observer, she might have seemed preoccupied only with her stitches. Yet behind her mild eyes, she was replaying each remark, each gesture she had witnessed that day. For Miss Marple understood better than most that the truth of a crime lay not only in actions, but in the small vanities, fears, and evasions of human nature. Somewhere among the chatter and the sketches, a pattern was forming. She could feel it as surely as one feels a storm in the air before the clouds gather. The question was not only who had silenced Lionel Quarren, but what secret they sought to keep hidden beneath the strokes of his pencil. The following morning dawned with a faint mist clinging to the hedgerows, as though the village itself wished to conceal what had transpired in its orchard. St. Mary Mead was awake early, its lanes busier than usual. Women lingered by their gates with watering cans in hand. Men found excuses to pass one another on the road, and all exchanged guarded remarks that scarcely concealed their appetite for speculation. Inspector Craddock, however, had no time for idle gossip. He arrived at the vicarage study once more with renewed determination, a sheaf of notes under his arm. The early investigation had confirmed little beyond the fact that Lionel Quarren had been poisoned, most likely by something introduced into his tea. Now the inspector sought to identify who might have had both motive and opportunity. Suspicion fell most swiftly upon Lydia Crane. Her open admiration for Quarren had been observed by half the village, and what is open admiration if not a potential scandal in the making? That she had spoken with the unusual warmth of the artist in her interview did not escape the inspector's notice. Moreover, her father's disapproval lent a ready-made conflict to the situation. It was easy enough to imagine a quarrel, perhaps a rejection, followed by a reckless act of desperation. Constable Pritchard, eager to show initiative, voiced the thought aloud. "If you ask me, sir, young women don't take kindly to being toyed with." He might have promised her something and then laughed at her for it. Craddock gave a non-committal grunt. Perhaps. But Lydia is very young, and poison requires deliberation, not impulse. We must not let appearances lead us too far. That morning, Lydia was seen walking briskly through the high street, her eyes red-rimmed, her step unsteady. Villagers watched her pass with expressions of mingled pity and suspicion. Mrs. Price Ridley, who happened to be at the milliner's, leaned toward Miss Hartnell and whispered in tones just loud enough to be overheard. "There goes guilt in petticoats, mark my words. She'll break before long." Miss Hartnell sniffed. "Nonsense. Girls break over love, not over crime. Still, I should not put it past her to do something foolish in a fit of temper. She always was headstrong." Meanwhile, Craddock directed his attention to Dr. Crane himself. The father's disapproval of Quarren had been plain, and what is disapproval but a motive when sharpened into anger? A protective father might well resort to desperate measures if he believed his daughter's future was compromised. It was not without precedent. When summoned for further questioning, Dr. Crane appeared calm but tired, as though the burden of suspicion had already weighed upon him. He denied categorically any involvement in Quarren's death. "I may have disliked the man's influence upon my daughter, Inspector, but I am a doctor. To administer poison would be an outrage against everything I stand for." His voice trembled with conviction, though Craddock noted that his hands, clasped tightly together, betrayed strain. Miss Marple, listening quietly from her customary corner, observed both father and daughter with interest. Lydia's defiance, Dr. Crane's severity, and the contrast were striking, yet beneath both lay the same thread of fear. Fear not only of what had happened, but of what might be revealed if the truth were uncovered. The artist's sketches provided further fuel for suspicion. Several villagers remarked upon the cruel accuracy of the drawings, and each seemed to find in them a reason for resentment. Mrs. Price Ridley remained indignant about her portrayal, while Dr. Haydock laughed uncomfortably when shown his likeness, remarking that it made him look like a man haunted by debts. "There are those who would take such liberties poorly," he added, his tone darkening. By midday, Craddock convened a brief meeting at the vicarage, gathering those most closely connected with the affair. He laid out the facts in measured tones. A man poisoned at a garden party, a sketchbook missing a page, and several witnesses whose accounts contained as many omissions as details. Then, without naming names, he hinted that one person stood particularly close to the matter at hand. His eyes flickered toward Lydia, who sat pale and silent beside her father. The effect was immediate. A ripple of whispers passed among those assembled. Mrs. Bantry pursed her lips as though to say she had known it all along. Miss Hartnell shifted uncomfortably in her chair, unwilling to speak but eager to listen. Lydia flushed scarlet, her eyes filling with tears. "I did not do it," she burst out, her voice breaking the tense silence. "You can think what you like, but I cared for him. Why would I harm him? He was the only one who ever believed I could be something more than just a doctor's daughter." She rose abruptly and fled the room, her footsteps echoing down the hall. Her departure left an uneasy quiet. Dr. Crane stood stiffly, his face ashen, then followed her without a word. The remaining villagers exchanged glances heavy with speculation. When the room had cleared, Craddock sighed heavily. It will not be easy to persuade a jury otherwise, should evidence point her way. The motive is clear enough. Jealousy, rejection, perhaps a desire to prevent scandal. An opportunity she certainly had, sitting near him at tea. But he paused, tapping his pencil against the notebook, which is all too obvious, too simple. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "Yes," she said after a moment, her tone mild. "Life is seldom so simple, Inspector. When things appear obvious, it is often because someone intends them to appear so." Craddock gave her a keen look. "And you think someone intends to mislead us?" She smiled faintly. "Human nature is endlessly inventive in disguising itself. But one must look at the small things, the gestures, the little inconsistencies. They often tell us more than the grand displays of emotion." The inspector leaned back, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. He had come to respect Miss Marple's quiet wisdom, though he would never admit to relying on it. Still, her words struck a chord. The very obviousness of Lydia as a suspect made him hesitate. That evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows lengthened across the village, St. Mary Mead buzzed with fresh gossip. Some declared Lydia guilty beyond doubt. Others insisted her father must have acted to protect her honor, and a few suggested that perhaps the poison had been meant for someone else entirely. Miss Marple, seated by her window with her knitting in her lap, reflected on the day's events. In her long experience, she had learned that people are quick to seize upon the convenient explanation, for it absolves them of deeper thought. Yet the truth, like a stitch hidden in a pattern, often lay beneath the surface, waiting for careful fingers to draw it out. The question was not simply who might have wished Lionel Querrin harm, but who had wished to make the harm appear so very plain. That, Miss Marple mused, was the true beginning of the puzzle. Inspector Craddock spent the next day in a determined sweep of the village, questioning those who had been present at the garden party. Constable Pritchard trailed behind with his notebook, recording every word with dutiful but uneven handwriting. St. Mary Mead, for all its quiet lanes and tidy cottages, now bristled with tension. Curtains twitched at the inspector's passing doorways, which seemed to sprout eavesdroppers like ivy. To the casual eye, the investigation was a matter of interviews and alibis, a process of elimination and suspicion. But for Miss Marple, who watched from her accustomed seat at the vicarage or from her own rose-bordered garden, the truth lay not in declarations, but in trifles. Human nature, she reflected, rarely concealed itself successfully for long. That morning, Craddock asked her to accompany him to the orchard once more, hoping perhaps that her sharp eyes might see what he had overlooked. Together, they walked beneath the boughs, the grass still damp with dew. The spot where Lionel Querrin had fallen was marked only by a faint impression in the earth and the broken handle of a teacup, carefully preserved the day before, but overlooked when the shards were gathered. Miss Marple stooped, her blue eyes peering closely. "How curious," she murmured, lifting the handle with delicate fingers. "This is from a different set." Craddock frowned. "Different?" "The vicarage has 2 services," she explained. "The better porcelain for guests, the plainer crockery for every day. This fragment is neither. I believe it must have been brought by someone, perhaps in error, perhaps not. Tea things are easily confused at large gatherings, but I cannot help feeling it matters which cup a man drinks from." The inspector took the handle, turning it over. The glaze was indeed unlike the vicarage's neat set of rose-patterned china. A faint blue crest, almost worn away, clung to the porcelain. Craddock made a note, though his brow suggested skepticism. Leaving the orchard, Miss Marple found herself recalling something else, an impression left on one of Querrin's discarded sketches, faint but distinct. That evening she fetched a soft pencil from her drawer and, with the patience of a woman who had often traced patterns for embroidery, gently rubbed across the sheet where the pressure of a drawing lingered. Slowly, the outline of her face emerged, ghostly but recognizable. It was not Lydia Crane, nor was it Mrs. Price Ridley with her tilted hat. The features that surfaced were older, sterner, with a downward curve of the mouth and an expression of guarded severity. Miss Marple set the sheet aside, her expression unreadable. She knew that face, though whether it had been meant as flattery or indictment, she could not yet say. The following afternoon, Craddock resumed his interviews. Mrs. Bantry offered tea and spoke animatedly of the missing sketchbook page, insisting that the removal of a drawing must conceal some dreadful revelation. Miss Hartnell interjected that artists were prone to fits of temper, tearing up work that displeased them. The inspector listened with growing impatience until Miss Marple, in her gentle way, observed that pages are not torn so neatly in fits of temper. It takes a steady hand to remove one without leaving ragged edges. Craddock shot her a look, but said nothing. He had already considered as much, though not with her quiet certainty. Later, at the boarding house, Mrs. Cleet confessed she had noticed one odd detail. In the afternoon before the party, Querrin had returned to his rooms later than usual and seemed unusually animated. He kept muttering about the truth coming to light, she recalled, wringing her hands. "I thought it was an artist's fancy, but he asked me for paste and scissors." Paste and scissors. I wondered if he was mounting one of his drawings. This snippet of information might have seemed trivial, but to Miss Marple it chimed with significance. If Querrin had indeed been preparing something, then the missing page had not been discarded in dissatisfaction. It had been set aside with purpose. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her parlour, the sketch with its faint impression before her, the broken teacup handle resting on the table. To most, they were scraps of nothing, yet to her they were threads, fine but strong, that might bind the pattern together. Her thoughts wandered back to the tea service itself. Who had poured Querrin's cup? It was Mrs. Price Ridley who had been nearest the table, boasting later of her seed cake. Lydia had hovered nearby, but her hands had been empty when the commotion began. Dr. Crane, though disapproving, had been some distance away in conversation with the vicar. Miss Marple's memory, sharp as ever, replayed the scene. The crucial detail was not who had held the teapot, but who had ensured that Querrin's cup was not one of the vicar's sets at all. For tea, she reflected, is rarely poisoned in the pot. It is the individual cup that betrays the hand of malice. The next morning she walked into the village to purchase wool and, as was her custom, listened to the chatter at the counter. Mrs. Bantry declared with confidence that Lydia Crane had hidden the missing drawing out of shame. Miss Hartnell disagreed, insisting it must have shown some rival or jealous suitor. Miss Marple said nothing, merely nodding politely. But she noticed the way Mrs. Price Ridley flushed at the mention of the drawing and changed the subject with undue haste. That small reaction, to anyone else unimportant, lodged firmly in Miss Marple's mind. People often betrayed themselves not by words, but by eagerness to avoid them. By the week's end, the investigation seemed to stall. Inspector Craddock grew restless, his notes filled with contradictions and half-truths. The village continued its speculation, voices rising in certainty without evidence. Yet Miss Marple, sitting quietly at her window with her knitting, felt the puzzle taking shape. The broken teacup, the missing sketch, the faintly impressed face all pointed toward something carefully hidden, something Quarren had uncovered with his unflinching pencil. And though she said nothing, she knew the time was approaching when silence would no longer serve. The murderer had taken pains to obscure their deed, just as the sketch had been torn from its binding, but paper leaves impressions, and so does guilt. It was only a matter of finding the moment to bring it to light. The rhythm of St. Mary Mead had grown uneven, as though the village clock no longer struck in harmony with its people. Ordinary routines, marketing, letter posting, and tending gardens continued, but each task was punctuated by furtive whispers and sideways glances. Suspicion had become as common as the scent of lavender that drifted through the hedgerows. Inspector Craddock, though diligent, found himself tangled in contradictions. Everyone seemed to have seen something, but no two accounts agreed. Mrs. Bantry swore she had noticed Dr. Crane watching Lionel Quarren with a frown, while Miss Hartnell insisted that Mrs. Price Ridley lingered far too near the refreshment table. And then there was young Lydia Crane, whose tears seemed too plentiful for innocence to some and too genuine for guilt to others. Into this muddle Miss Marple listened, knitted, and observed. She knew that when gossip grows unchecked, it is like ivy on a wall, twisting, suffocating, and concealing the truth beneath. It was time, she felt, for certain threads to be drawn out more plainly. Her first opportunity came when she happened upon Lydia in the lane, her eyes red and her posture slumped. The girl, usually so brisk, looked defeated. Miss Marple greeted her gently and remarked that the roses in Dr. Haydock's garden were late to bloom this year. Lydia, startled, almost laughed. "You don't think I did it, do you, Miss Marple?" she asked suddenly, her voice trembling. "My dear, people do all manner of foolish things in youth," Miss Marple replied, her tone as mild as if discussing jam recipes. "But deliberate cruelty requires a different sort of mind altogether. I do not think yours is made that way." Lydia's eyes filled with tears. He made sketches of everyone. "Not just me." He said people revealed themselves without knowing it, but there was one drawing. He said it would ruin someone if it were ever shown. She bit her lip. "I think that's why it's gone. But I can't say more promises." Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, asked no further questions. Promises made in fear often broken of their own accord. Forcing the matter would only drive the girl deeper into silence. That afternoon brought another revelation, though of a very different sort. Inspector Craddock summoned Dr. Haydock to the vicarage for further questioning. The doctor, normally genial, arrived with uncharacteristic irritation. "You're chasing phantoms, Inspector," he declared. "I attended to the body at once." "Poison, yes, but I cannot yet say what kind. A laboratory analysis is needed. I resent the implication that I could be involved simply because I know more drugs than others here." Craddock's expression was unreadable. "It is precisely because you know more that your position requires scrutiny. Knowledge, Doctor, can be turned to many uses." Dr. Haydock stiffened, then forced a laugh. "If I wished to rid the world of Lionel Quarren, I should have done so in a way less theatrical than poisoning his teacup at a garden party." Miss Marple, seated by the fireplace, watched the exchange. She noted not only the doctor's indignation, but the way his eyes flickered when the missing sketch was mentioned. It was a fleeting glance, yet it lingered in her mind. People rarely look away from things they truly do not know. Meanwhile, Mrs. Price Ridley grew louder in her assertions. She declared to anyone who would listen that Lydia's hysterics proved her guilt. "Mark my words," she told Mrs. Bantry, "that girl will hang her head in shame before long." Yet Miss Marple noticed something odd when she called upon Mrs. Price Ridley one morning. The lady, proud of her orderly home, had placed a porcelain cup with a faint blue crest among her china, as though it belonged. Miss Marple's sharp eyes recognized it at once as the twin to the fragment found in the orchard. She made no remark at the time, simply admiring the woman's begonias in the window box, but the image of the mismatched porcelain lodged firmly in her mind. Why should Mrs. Price Ridley possess a cup of the same design as the broken handle? And why make a show of displaying it? Sometimes people hid things in plain sight, confident that boldness would be mistaken for innocence. The tension reached its peak at the Women's Institute meeting later that week. The hall buzzed with speculation, and when Mrs. Bantry innocently remarked that Lionel Queren had told her he was working on a study of truth, Mrs. Price Ridley snapped that artists often imagined importance where none existed. Lydia, seated nearby, burst out that Mrs. Price Ridley had been the subject of that missing sketch, and that it was not flattering. A silence fell. Mrs. Price Ridley flushed crimson and declared that Lydia was spreading falsehoods to cover her own disgrace. The argument escalated until Miss Marple, with her gentle voice, interjected that disputes rarely lead to understanding and that tea was best taken before words grew too sharp. But she had seen enough. The anger, the fluster, the unguarded words all revealed more than they concealed. It was plain that Lionel Queren's missing drawing had touched a nerve deeper than simple vanity. That evening, Inspector Craddock visited Miss Marple at her cottage. He looked weary, his notes untidy from so many conflicting statements. "It's a nest of wasps, Miss Marple. Every person I speak to has a motive, yet none is sufficient to act. The girl is the obvious suspect, but I cannot escape the feeling it's been contrived to appear so." Miss Marple poured tea with her usual calm. "Do you recall the old saying, Inspector, that one can sometimes hide a tree best by planting it in a forest? A guilty party may arrange matters so that suspicion falls upon the most obvious candidate. But people, you know, cannot always conceal the smaller details. A porcelain cup, for example, may tell a story when lips do not." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "You've noticed something, haven't you?" "I have noticed," Miss Marple said, "that people are very poor at consistency. Lies rarely match from one day to the next. I should not be surprised if the truth reveals itself when someone is pressed in precisely the right way." As the inspector left, the village bell rang 9. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her needles moving in a steady rhythm. She thought of the hidden sketch, the mismatched porcelain, the frightened glance of Dr. Haydock, and the desperate anger of Mrs. Price Ridley. The pattern was still incomplete, but she felt its shape growing clearer. The crime had not only been about silencing Lionel Queren. It was about preventing something from being seen, something captured in a drawing that could not be dismissed as fancy. And in that drawing lay the secret that bound the orchard, the teacup, and the fear that rippled through St. Mary Mead. For Miss Marple, the matter was no longer simply a question of who had poisoned a cup of tea. It was a question of what truth that cut and that missing page had been meant to obscure. The days following the Women's Institute quarrel were thick with unease. St. Mary Mead had always prided itself on civility, but civility now rested on brittle glass. A single word could set tongues wagging and reputations trembling. The death of Lionel Queren was no longer just a tragedy. It had become the mirror in which every villager feared his or her own reflection might appear. Inspector Craddock pressed on, weary but resolute. Each interview yielded fragments of motive but no firm ground. Mrs. Price Ridley's temper had made her look all too ready to silence an insult. Dr. Crane's severity suggested paternal fury. Lydia's grief was still raw, though suspicion clung to her like burrs to a skirt. Dr. Haydock, too, carried shadows in his eyes when the missing drawing was mentioned. Then, one grey morning, another event shattered what little certainty remained. Mrs. Cleet, the boarding housekeeper, arrived breathless at the vicarage, her face ashen. She carried in her hand an envelope, its seal broken, her fingers trembling as she thrust it toward Inspector Craddock. "I found this slipped under my door during the night," she stammered. "It's his handwriting, Inspector. Mr. Querin's. I swear it." Inside lay a single sheet, covered in bold strokes of pencil. It was not a finished sketch, but a rough outline of a scene of a woman, standing stiffly, with one hand raised as though in defiance. The features were indistinct, hurriedly drawn, yet the resemblance to Mrs. Price Ridley was unmistakable. Beneath the sketch were words, scrawled in a firm hand. "The mask will break." Craddock frowned deeply, holding the sheet to the light. "When did you find this?" "This morning," Mrs. Cleet whispered. "But it wasn't there when I locked up last night. Someone must have placed it after dark. I don't know whether it was meant for me or for you, or for the whole village to see." The inspector dismissed her gently, but once she had gone, he turned to Miss Marple, who sat quietly by the hearth. "What do you make of it? If it truly is Querin's hand, then he meant to expose someone. If it is not, then it's a crude attempt to point blame." Miss Marple studied the drawing. Her eyes lingered not on the figure, but on the uneven strokes of the pencil. "It is curious," she said softly, "that the lines are less confident than his usual work, almost as though they were imitating his style, not creating it. You think it's a forgery?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that people who try to copy another's hand often forget that handwriting changes with mood. A man on the verge of revelation would not draw so cautiously." Craddock grunted, though he made a note to send the sheet for analysis. But the discovery ignited the village afresh. Word spread by afternoon, and by tea-time every drawing-room buzzed with the news that Querin had left a final warning. Mrs. Price Ridley, upon hearing of the sketch, flew into outrage. "It is a vile trick," she declared at the Blue Boar, her voice trembling. "Someone is determined to blacken my name. I shall not endure it." She threatened legal action, though the villagers whispered that outrage is but a veil for fear. That evening, however, a more disturbing occurrence took place. Constable Pritchard, making his routine patrol, noticed a faint light flickering in Querin's former lodgings. Assuming Mrs. Cleet had left a candle burning, he entered to extinguish it, only to find the room in disarray. Papers had been scattered across the floor, drawers pulled open and the wastebasket overturned. On the desk lay another sketch, half burned, the edges curling with flame before he smothered it. When shown to Inspector Craddock the next morning, the fragment revealed only part of an image, a hand clutching what seemed to be a vial or small bottle. The rest had been consumed by fire. Craddock slammed his fist against the desk. Someone is determined to erase every trace of whatever Querin uncovered, and they are bold enough to break into his room to do it. Miss Marple, summoned to examine the fragment, ran her finger lightly along the singed edge. "It is not merely boldness, Inspector. It is fear. Fear compels people to take risks that prudence would forbid." The inspector nodded grimly. "But fear of what? If Querin discovered something damaging, it must have been more than mere vanity. A sketch can sting pride, but pride alone does not drive a person to murder." The village reeled. 2 sketches now in circulation, one whispered warning and a boarding-house intrusion. Some muttered that Querin had left behind a trail of secrets too dark to survive him. Others insisted that the murderer, desperate to cover their tracks, was growing reckless. Through it all, Miss Marple remained her calm, unassuming self. She visited Mrs. Bantry for tea, listened to Miss Hartnell's sharp opinions, and exchanged mild remarks at the grocer's. Yet she observed carefully who grew pale at the mention of the sketches, who sought to deflect conversation, who appeared to listen too intently when others spoke. It was during one such visit, at Dr. Haydock's surgery, that she noticed a telling detail. On his desk lay a small bottle of tincture, half empty. He explained it was for a patient, but Miss Marple observed the faint stain on his cuff where a drop had spilled. It was the kind of oversight no careful man would make unless distracted. She said nothing, merely knitting a row as she listened to his reassurances. But the image of the burnt sketch hand holding a vial emerged with the stain on his sleeve in her mind. Later, in the quiet of her cottage, Miss Marple reviewed the threads. A broken cup from a different set, a missing drawing, a forged or planted sketch, and now an attempt to burn another. Someone was weaving a tapestry of confusion, but tapestries, however tangled, are made up of single threads. Pull the right one, and the whole design unravels. She set aside her knitting, folded her hands, and looked into the fading light. The case was growing more dangerous, for when murderers grow desperate, they are seldom content to let one crime stand alone. The discovery of the half-burned sketch had rattled even the most complacent villagers. Fear now walked the lanes of St. Mary Mead as openly as the milk cart. People lowered their voices when speaking of Lionel Querrin, yet their eyes darted with restless suspicion. Every face seemed capable of secrets, every remark layered with meaning. Inspector Craddock grew increasingly exasperated. "It's like chasing smoke," he confessed to Miss Marple as they walked together down the lane one afternoon. "Every time I think I have a lead, another twist confounds it. The forged sketch, the break-in, the burning of the drawing, it's too elaborate for mere panic. Someone is trying to play us like fools." "Perhaps," Inspector Miss Marple said mildly. "But you must remember that people are often clumsy in their cleverness. In attempting to disguise themselves, they reveal far more than they intend. That is why it is best to observe quietly. People betray themselves in trifles." Her words, as ever, lodged in Craddock's mind, though he would not admit aloud how much weight he gave them. It was in her own gentle way that Miss Marple decided upon her course. If direct questions led only to evasions, then it was time for a softer approach. She would allow each suspect to speak, not to her directly perhaps, but in the safety of their own pride or fear. And she would listen not to what they claimed, but to what they let slip. Her first visit was to Mrs. Price Ridley. Miss Marple arrived with a small gift of homemade marmalade, a gesture so ordinary that it disarmed suspicion. Over tea she admired the begonias in the window box and praised the lady's talent for maintaining order in her household. Mrs. Price Ridley, flattered, spoke expansively of the burden of social standing, of how difficult it was to keep one's reputation intact amidst scandal. Miss Marple listened, nodding. Then, quite casually, she remarked upon the pretty porcelain cup with the faint blue crest, which had caught her eye during an earlier visit. "It must be part of a very old set," she mused. "So easily confused at gatherings, I dare say." Mrs. Price Ridley stiffened. "I should never confuse my china, Miss Marple. That cup has been in my family for years." "Why do you ask?" "Oh, no reason at all," Miss Marple replied, smiling sweetly. "It only struck me that Mr. Querrin's teacup, when he died, was not of the vicar's service. How curious it is how such little things happen." The silence that followed was sharp. Mrs. Price Ridley changed the subject with almost desperate haste, turning the conversation to the Women's Institute raffle. Miss Marple noted the reaction and tucked it away, as carefully as she might a loose thread for later mending. Her next call was to Dr. Haydock. She feigned a mild concern about her rheumatism, an ailment that had long provided her with convenient pretexts. While he examined her wrist and assured her that exercise was more important than medicine, she observed his desk. The bottle of tincture she had noticed before was gone. Instead, he had arranged his papers with unusual neatness, as though to erase any sign of disorder. "Doctors," Miss Marple said gently, "must be very careful with their medicines. One slip could be so dreadful." Dr. Haydock laughed too loudly. "Indeed, indeed, that is why one keeps one's cabinets locked. But you must handle the bottles yourself, of course," Miss Marple continued softly, "and sometimes the stoppers can be very stubborn. I imagine it is easy to spill a drop without noticing." The doctor's smile faltered for the briefest moment. He turned away, shuffling his notes. Yes, well, one must be vigilant. But I assure you, Miss Marple, there has been no such mishap here. Again, she made no remark, only thanking him kindly and leaving with the air of a woman satisfied by professional advice. Yet inwardly, she compared his unease to Mrs. Price Ridley's. Both had reacted too strongly, as though fearing discovery more than mere suspicion. Her final test that week was of Lydia Crane. She found the girl in the garden behind the doctor's house, sitting on a stone bench with a book unopened in her lap. Lydia's face was pale, her eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. "My dear," Miss Marple said kindly, settling beside her, "when one is young, everything seems so terribly final. But life has a way of surprising us. We endure much, even when we think we cannot." Lydia's lip trembled. "Everyone thinks I poisoned him, even you, perhaps." "No, child," Miss Marple replied softly. "I think you cared for him in your way. And caring, though painful, does not lead so easily to murder. Tell me, did he confide in you about his sketches?" Lydia hesitated. Only one of them was dangerous. He said he had captured a truth that would not be forgiven. He didn't tell me whose face it was, but I think he was afraid. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on her arm. "Fear, my dear, is a very telling thing. People who are afraid do not always act as they wish, but as they must. Remember that." When Miss Marple returned home that evening, she sat with her knitting needles in hand and reflected on what she had learned. Mrs. Price Ridley guarded her porcelain cup too closely, as though it bound her to the crime. Dr. Haydock had tried too hard to erase traces of a mistake. Lydia spoke of fear, not guilt, a distinction Miss Marple never underestimated. Later, Inspector Craddock stopped by, his brow furrowed. "We're getting nowhere," he admitted. "Every clue leads in circles. If only I could catch one of them off guard." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "Sometimes, Inspector, it is not a matter of catching them off guard. It is a matter of giving them the chance to reveal themselves. People, when left to their own devices, often betray their own secrets." And indeed, she sensed that the village was nearing such a moment. The lies had grown too heavy to bear, the pretenses too fragile to sustain. Soon, someone would falter. For in St. Mary Mead, beneath the quiet lanes and the neat hedgerows, the truth was stirring like a sketch faintly visible beneath the page, waiting for the hand that would uncover it. By the close of the week, St. Mary Mead bore the strained air of a village under siege. Not by soldiers, of course, but by suspicion. Even the ordinary sights, the baker's boy on his round, the clatter of milk bottles on the step seemed muted, overshadowed by the constant hum of whispers. Inspector Craddock, weary from endless interviews, confessed to Miss Marple that he felt the case slipping like sand between his fingers. "Each of them has something to hide," he muttered, thumbing through his untidy notebook. But which secret was worth killing for? Miss Marple, knitting serenely by the window, gave her mild reply. "When several people look guilty, Inspector, it is often because they are guilty, but not all of murder. Villages hold many kinds of secrets. The art lies in distinguishing which ones lead to death and which are merely human folly." The inspector sighed, but could not help but smile. He had come to rely on her quiet wisdom, though he never admitted it outright. That afternoon, he decided to press harder. Summoning Mrs. Price Ridley to the vicarage study, he laid the forged sketch on the table before her. The pencil strokes, clumsy though they were, still bore her unmistakable likeness. "Someone wanted this to be seen," Craddock said sharply. "What do you know about it?" Mrs. Price Ridley stiffened, her eyes flashing indignation. "I know nothing. A vile trick, that's what it is. You can't mean to suggest I suggest only that Lionel Querrin drew someone in this village whom he believed was dangerous. Was it you?" Her lips trembled, then pressed firmly together. "I will not be insulted further," she declared. rising with the air of a woman affronted beyond endurance. Yet Miss Marple, who had been quietly present, observed the tremor in her hands as she snatched up her gloves. Outrage, she reflected, was often a shield for fear. Later that same day, Dr. Haydock was called again. Craddock asked him directly about the tincture bottles in his surgery and whether any were unaccounted for. The doctor flushed. "I run a proper practice, Inspector. Nothing is unaccounted for. Do you imagine I should jeopardize my career over some wandering artist?" Miss Marple, knitting in her lap, remarked gently, "Doctors sometimes keep medicines at hand for their own use, do they not? A little something for nerves or to ease a restless night." The doctor's laugh was too loud. "Perhaps. But what of it? That hardly makes me a poisoner." He left soon after, his step heavy on the vicarage path. Craddock frowned. "They're all on edge. Each one jumps like a startled rabbit when pressed. It's as though the whole village is guilty of something." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed softly. "But remember, Inspector, murder is rarely an isolated act. It grows from soil long prepared, resentments, fears, and ambitions. We must ask not only who could have poisoned a cup, but who most feared what Lionel Querrin might reveal." The next day brought an unexpected development. Mrs. Bantry arrived at Miss Marple's cottage with eyes wide from excitement. "You'll never believe it," she whispered, leaning close as though the hedges themselves might be listening. "One of Querrin's sketches has turned up hidden behind a loose board in the parish hall." Indeed it had. The drawing, retrieved with care, depicted a man's hand holding a small glass vial. The detail was unmistakable, precise in a way only Querrin could capture. Though the face was not included, the implication was clear. Inspector Craddock studied it grimly. This could implicate anyone. The doctor, certainly, but others too. Querrin was not careless with his subjects. He meant to say something with this. Miss Marple, examining the sketch, observed a faint smudge of ink in the corner where a word had been hastily rubbed out. She leaned closer, discerning only a fragment of the letter's dock. "Curious," she murmured. "It could be Haydock, of course. But one must never leap to conclusions. Artists often leave us puzzles, sometimes deliberately." The discovery sent a fresh wave of speculation through the village. Some whispered openly of Dr. Haydock, pointing to his knowledge of drugs. Others muttered that Mrs. Price Ridley had contrived to plant the sketch to deflect attention. The village was a kettle close to boiling, each theory adding to the steam. In this fevered atmosphere, Lydia Crane grew more withdrawn. She was seen rarely, and when she did appear, her eyes darted anxiously, as though hunted by unseen eyes. Miss Marple paid her a quiet visit one evening and found her sitting with a letter clutched in her hand. "It's from him," Lydia whispered. "From Lionel. He wrote it the day before he died. He said he had uncovered something that would make enemies tremble, but he didn't say what." She pressed the letter into Miss Marple's hands. "I can't bear to keep it." The letter, in Querrin's bold script, spoke of a revelation buried in plain sight and warned that those who wear masks cannot wear them forever. It named no one, but the urgency in its tone was unmistakable. Miss Marple folded it carefully, her expression calm though her mind stirred. The words echoed those scrawled beneath the forged sketch, but here, in Querrin's true hand, they carried conviction. When Inspector Craddock read the letter, his face hardened. So he did know something. He was silenced before he could speak it. "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly, "and now others are growing desperate to ensure it remains hidden. You must tread carefully, Inspector. When secrets begin to unravel, the threads pull tighter before they break." That night, the village lay in uneasy silence. Dogs barked at shadows, windows were latched earlier than usual, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, the murderer must have felt the circle narrowing, the net drawing in. And in her cottage, Miss Marple knitted steadily, the faint click of her needles keeping time with her thoughts. She felt it in the tension, the tightening, the approach of revelation. Soon, the mask would slip. And when it did, the truth would not only expose a killer, but the hidden fears of a village that had tried so hard to keep its secrets buried. The unease in St. Mary Mead had reached its height. By now, even the most ordinary encounters with a passing word at the grocer's, a polite nod in the lane, were laden with suspicion. It was as though Lionel Querin's death had stripped away the polite curtains that covered the windows of village life, leaving the bare interiors exposed to view. Everyone seemed watchful, yet everyone feared being watched. Inspector Craddock, though methodical, found the case slipping into endless speculation. The forged sketch, the half-burned drawing, the hidden letter all pointed to secrets, but not yet to a name. The villagers, restless and eager for certainty, whispered Lydia Crane's guilt more loudly with each passing day, yet Craddock remained uneasy. "It is too neat," he confided in Miss Marple. "Too convenient. I cannot bring myself to believe she orchestrated such an elaborate deception." Miss Marple, sitting with her knitting, nodded. "Quite so. Young women may act impulsively, Inspector, but they do not usually contrive such layered schemes. Nothing has the stamp of a mind practiced in concealment. What you must look for is not who appears guilty, but who works hardest to see another appear so." She knew the time had come for a test, quiet and subtle, but sharp enough to pierce through pretense. Human beings, she often reflected, could maintain falsehoods only so long as they were not pressed in the right place. One gentle nudge, at the correct angle, could topple the entire façade. Her opportunity came in the form of a village tea. Mrs. Bantry, ever hospitable, invited a small circle to her drawing-room. Dr. Haydock, Mrs. Price Ridley, Lydia Crane, and the vicar and his wife. Miss Marple, of course, was included, her presence considered as natural as the tea service itself. The gathering, though outwardly ordinary, was charged with a nervous energy. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her customary corner, allowed the conversation to drift through its polite motions, remarks on the weather, the lateness of the roses, the merits of seed cake versus sponge. Then, when the teacups had been filled, she set her knitting aside with deliberate casualness. "How curious it is," she remarked, "that Mr. Querin's death should hinge upon a teacup. So simple a thing, yet so decisive. It reminds me of poor Mr. Harper, years ago in Gloucester. He too was undone by a cup not his own. A hostess had provided one from a mismatched set, you see, and in that detail lay the truth of the matter." The words, delivered in her mildest tone, passed like a ripple through the room. Lydia paled, her eyes darting to her father. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly, while Mrs. Price Ridley stiffened visibly, her hand tightening on the arm of her chair. Dr. Haydock gave a sharp laugh. "Really, Miss Marple, you have such a gift for morbid tales. I wonder if you find them suitable for tea." "Oh, but tea is where the truth often lies," Miss Marple replied gently. "One sees who serves, who selects, who insists upon a certain cup. People reveal themselves in the smallest domestic acts." Silence followed, thick and uncomfortable. Mrs. Price Ridley's cheeks flushed a mottled red, and she reached for her saucer with trembling fingers. "Are we to endure insinuations now?" she demanded. "This village is drowning in gossip. To drag China into it is absurd." "Absurd?" Miss Marple echoed mildly. "Perhaps. But then it is curious, is it not, that Mr. Querin's broken cup bore a crest not belonging to the vicarage? Such details are seldom accidents." Mrs. Price Ridley set her cup down with a clatter. "You suggest I bring my own crockery to a garden party?" "Ridiculous!" "I suggest nothing at all," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I only recall that people sometimes cling to objects when they feel unsafe. A familiar cup, a particular charity can be a kind of shield, don't you think?" The tension hung like a storm cloud. Mrs. Bantry attempted to smooth it over by remarking on the village fete, but the atmosphere did not recover. Each guest departed soon after, their farewells curt. Yet Miss Marple was satisfied. for in that drawing room she had seen what she needed the guilty to react with disproportionate fear, when the right thread is tugged. Later that evening, Inspector Craddock came to Miss Marple's cottage, weary but curious. She recounted the gathering in her gentle, unhurried way, noting each reaction with precision. "The teacup again," Craddock muttered, rubbing his chin. "You return to it as though it were the heart of the matter." "It is the heart, Inspector," Miss Marple replied. "For murder, when it comes, it must always take a practical form. One cannot poison an entire pot of tea at such a gathering. Too many might taste it. Too many accidents might occur. No, the poisoner must ensure that only one cup was tainted. That requires preparation, not chance." Craddock frowned. "And you think Mrs. Price Ridley brought her own?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think the guilty often reveal themselves when the ordinary is made extraordinary. To most, a cup is just a cup. But to some, it is the very instrument of survival. And when one sees them tremble at its mention, one knows one is close to the truth." The inspector leaned back, staring at her with grudging admiration. "You've got a way of seeing straight through them, Miss Marple. I almost pity the fellow or lady responsible." Almost. But Miss Marple knew the matter was not finished. The murderer, sensing the walls closing in, would grow more desperate. A cornered creature is most dangerous, and she felt certain another move would come soon. As she resumed her knitting by the lamplight, her thoughts moved steadily, stitch by stitch. The pattern of lies was nearly complete. All that remained was to draw the final thread and watch the design unravel to reveal the truth that had been hidden in the shadows of St. Mary Mead. The village of St. Mary Mead was unnaturally hushed that morning, as though it sensed some decisive moment approaching. The very air seemed weighted, heavy with expectation. Even the bird-song outside Miss Marple's cottage was subdued, a faint chorus against the silence of the lanes. Inspector Craddock had agreed somewhat reluctantly to Miss Marple's suggestion that the suspects should be invited to gather together. "It feels theatrical," he grumbled as they walked toward the vicarage hall. "But you insist that when people are placed side by side, truth shows itself." Miss Marple smiled serenely, her knitting bag hanging lightly from her arm. "Indeed, Inspector. In groups, people do not behave as they intend. They react to one another, to stray remarks, to the weight of silence, and reactions, more than declarations, are where truth resides." By 3 o'clock, the chosen company was assembled. Mrs. Price Ridley swept in with rigid dignity, her hat perched at its most severe angle. Dr. Haydock arrived with brisk, almost defiant energy, his coat flung over one arm as though he had little patience for formalities. Lydia Crane came pale and nervous, her father beside her, stern and protective. Mrs. Bantry was there too, cheerful in manner but with eyes, bright with curiosity, and the vicar and his wife presided with anxious courtesy. Inspector Craddock opened proceedings with the grave formality of a man accustomed to command. He laid out the facts of the case as they stood. Lionel Querrin was poisoned during a garden party. A sketchbook was missing a page. False drawings were planted, and attempts were made to burn others. He spoke of motives: wounded pride, fear of exposure, jealousy, or resentment. "We are close to the truth," he concluded. "But it is not for me alone to draw it. The truth lies among you." Silence followed, broken only by the faint ticking of the vicar's clock. Eyes shifted uneasily. No one wished to be the first to speak. Miss Marple cleared her throat gently. "Perhaps I might say a word, Inspector. It seems to me that Lionel Querrin was not merely an artist, but an observer of people. He saw things others preferred hidden, and he recorded them in his sketches, sometimes with kindness, sometimes with cruel clarity. That is why he was dangerous. He held a mirror to the village, and someone feared the reflection." Mrs. Price Ridley bristled. "If you mean me, Miss Marple, I will not endure the insult. I told you before that drawing was a trick, a forgery meant to smear my name." Miss Marple's eyes were kind but penetrating. Forged, perhaps. But it was convenient, was it not, that suspicion should fall upon Lydia, whose open admiration for Mr. Querin was plain to all. And more convenient still that attention should linger upon false sketches rather than the missing page that Mr. Querin himself was removed. Dr. Haydock shifted uneasily. Are we to speculate endlessly on a piece of paper none of us has seen? Not endlessly, Miss Marple said softly. Sometimes the absence of a thing speaks louder than its presence. Mr. Querin's missing drawing was carefully removed. Not destroyed in anger, not cast aside, but hidden, and when one considers who among us trembles most at the mention of it, the outline of the truth begins to show. Her words fell into the room like stones into still water, rippling outward. Mrs. Price Ridley opened her mouth to protest again, but her voice faltered. Dr. Haydock's jaw tightened. Lydia clasped her hand so tightly her knuckles whitened. Inspector Craddock leaned forward. And who is it, Miss Marple, that you believe most feared that missing page? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once, twice, before she set them down. I believe Mr. Querin drew not only likenesses, but truths. He sketched what people reveal in their unguarded moments. And the missing page, I suspect, contained the likeness of one among us with something more damning than vanity at stake. Something that, if seen, could not be explained away. The vicar's wife gasped softly, her eyes darting toward Mrs. Price Ridley. But Miss Marple did not yet have a name. Instead, she allowed the silence to stretch, the weight of expectation pressing upon every heart. It was in such silences, she knew, that people betrayed themselves, and betray themselves they did. Mrs. Price Ridley snapped that she was tired of being made a scapegoat, her voice shrill, her eyes wild. If there was such a page, then it was surely planted to ruin me, she cried. Dr. Haydock interjected quickly, too quickly. Or perhaps it was nothing but fancy. Artists exaggerate. We needn't put stock in every line of pencil. His tone, meant to dismiss, carried a nervous edge that did not escape Miss Marple's notice. Lydia, trembling, spoke at last. I saw it, she whispered. Every head turned. The missing page. He showed me the outline. It wasn't finished, but I knew who it was meant to be. He begged me to keep it secret because he feared it would provoke anger, and I promised him I would. That is why I've said nothing. Her father's face turned ashen. Lydia, what are you saying? But Lydia pressed on, tears filling her eyes. He drew Dr. Haydock. Not as he looks to patients, smiling and confident, but as he looked, when he thought no one was watching, with a vial in his hand. She faltered with a kind of cruelty in his eyes. I didn't want to believe it. I still don't. But that's the truth. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Dr. Haydock sprang to his feet, his face flushed. This is absurd, a child's fancy. The girl imagines, not imagining, Miss Marple interrupted gently, yet firmly. She confirms what the burned sketch suggested, what the hidden letter implied, and what your own unease betrayed when questioned. You see, Inspector Mr. Querin captured in his sketch the truth of a man who knew how to use poisons, and the man who most feared that likeness has worked tirelessly to obscure it ever since. The silence that followed was profound. Dr. Haydock stood rigid, his hands clenched, his denial choking unspoken in his throat. Mrs. Price Ridley, pale and trembling, sank back into her chair. Lydia wept quietly, her father unable to comfort her. Inspector Craddock rose slowly, his gaze fixed on the doctor. We are not finished here, Dr. Haydock. Not by a long measure. Miss Marple folded her knitting neatly into her bag. She knew the end was close. The truth, carefully hidden beneath forged sketches, broken cups and whispered lies, had finally begun to surface. The net had tightened, and the mask was slipping. Yet she also knew the most delicate task remained to gather every thread and weave them into a pattern so plain that even those who wished to look away could not deny what it revealed. The vicarage hall was still heavy with the aftershocks of Lydia's confession. No one seemed able to speak, though many looked as if words trembled on their lips. Dr. Haydock stood rigid, his face drained of color, his eyes burning with suppressed fury. Inspector Craddock's gaze, sharp and unwavering, fixed on him as though weighing the precise moment to act. Miss Marple broke the silence with the quiet authority of someone who did not often raise her voice, but whose words carried more weight for their gentleness. "Perhaps," she said softly, "it would be best if I explained how all these threads join together. It may bring a little clarity to what has seemed confused." The eyes of the room turned to her. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her curiosity written plain upon her face. Mrs. Price Ridley sat stiffly, her gloved hands trembling in her lap. Dr. Crane looked torn between indignation and disbelief, while Lydia's pale features reflected both dread and relief. Miss Marple began, as ever, at the smallest detail. When Mr. Queren collapsed, everyone assumed the poison had been introduced into the common teapot, but that would have endangered others. No, it was his individual cup that was tainted, and that cup, as I noticed, did not belong to the vicarage set. It bore instead a faint blue crest, quite unlike any of the parish crockery. She turned her eyes gently toward Mrs. Price Ridley. "That was why I was so interested in your porcelain cup, my dear. It matched the fragment from the orchard. I believe you lent it, willingly or unwillingly, to our unfortunate artist. Not for reasons of kindness, but because someone wished to ensure he drank from that particular vessel. The poison was already waiting there." A murmur ran through the room. Mrs. Price Ridley's lips moved, but no sound came. "But of course," Miss Marple continued, "one must ask who supplied the poison itself. Here again, the matter is clearer than it first appears. For who among us had both access and knowledge? Dr. Haydock, who keeps medicines in his practice and who, as I observed, had once carelessly stained his cuff with some tincture." The burned sketch confirmed Lionel Queren had drawn a hand clutching a vial. He had seen something or understood something that implicated the doctor. Dr. Haydock gave a harsh laugh, but it rang hollow. Speculation, nothing more. "An artist's fancy." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Not fancy. Truth. He captured not what was shown to patients, but what lay beneath the coldness of a man who had perhaps used his skill for purposes less noble than healing. And Lionel Queren was preparing to reveal it. He even wrote as much in his letter, speaking of masks that cannot be worn forever. That is why he was silenced." Lydia, weeping quietly, whispered, "But why him? Why kill him at all?" "Because," Miss Marple said, "he had no discretion. He told too many people that he had seen something dreadful. He made too much of his missing sketch. And worst of all, he was fearless in capturing the truth in his art." Dr. Haydock realized that if the drawing came to light, it would cast suspicion where he could least afford it. So he acted. He enlisted Mrs. Price Ridley, whether by persuasion or intimidation, to provide the tainted cup. He then contrived to place it where Queren would receive it, knowing one sip of tea would end the matter. The inspector leaned forward. "And the forged sketch? The burning of another?" Miss Marple's eyes softened. Those were later attempts at confusion. Once suspicion began to rise, someone sought to scatter false trails, planting drawings, destroying others, but each act betrayed the same fear that the missing page would be discovered. Fear, Inspector, is the truest confession of all. Dr. Haydock's composure cracked. "This is absurd," he cried. "You accuse me of the strength of gossip and doodles." "I'm a man of science," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "is not proof against conscience. Your anger now is the same anger Lionel Queren caught with his pencil, the anger of a man cornered, whose pride and career were threatened. I've lived long enough to know the look of guilt when it trembles behind indignation, and I dare say Inspector Craddock will find the bottle missing from your surgery if he looks closely enough." The silence that followed was dreadful. Mrs. Price Ridley moaned faintly, her hand to her brow. Dr. Crane put his arm around Lydia, shielding her as though from a blow. Mrs. Bantry gasped, yet her eyes shone with the dreadful thrill of truth revealed. Inspector Craddock rose, his voice stern. "Dr. Haydock, I must ask you to accompany me. We shall search your premises. And if Miss Marple is correct, as I believe she is, you will have much to answer for." The doctor sank into his chair, his face ashen. He muttered something under his breath, words too low to catch, but they had the defeated tone of a man who knew resistance was useless. Miss Marple, folding her hands over her knitting bag, sighed softly. "It is always the little things, Inspector. A mismatched cup, a stain upon a cuff, a tremor at the mention of a sketch. Human nature reveals itself in trifles. That is why Lionel Quarren was so dangerous. He drew what others tried to conceal, and that is why he died." The gathering dispersed in silence, the weight of revelation pressing heavily upon every soul. Outside, the village seemed unchanged, the hedgerows still green, the cottages still neat, the church spire still rising above it all. Yet beneath that familiar surface, nothing was the same. Trust had been broken, secrets dragged into the light, and a man of standing shown to be capable of murder. As dusk settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat once more by her window, her needles clicking softly. She reflected not with triumph, but with quiet melancholy. For though justice had been served, the truth was never without cost. A young girl's heart had been bruised, reputations shaken, and the calm of the village shattered. Still, she thought, human nature will always weave its patterns of pride, vanity, love, and fear. And perhaps that is why her task was never finished. For where people live together, secrets take root, and where secrets take root, there will always be the shadow of crime. The days after Dr. Haydock's arrest were strangely quiet in St. Mary Mead. Not the usual quiet of a village accustomed to its own rhythm, but a silence heavy with unease. People went about their errands with lowered voices, as though speaking too loudly might disturb the fragile order that had been restored. The Blue Boar, normally a place for genial chatter, seemed subdued. Customers whispered in corners, glancing about before voicing their opinions. Some declared that they had always mistrusted the doctor, pointing to his brusque manner or the occasional sharpness of his tongue. Others shook their heads, insisting they had never suspected such a man of harboring darkness. Yet none denied the relief of having the mystery explained, for the unknown had weighed heavily on every household. Mrs. Price Ridley, though spared the worst of suspicion, remained rattled. She was seen less frequently in the high street, her sharp tones subdued. When she did appear, she spoke with unusual gentleness, as though aware that her eagerness to condemn Lydia had left a sour taste among her neighbors. Miss Hartnell remarked that it might do her good to learn humility, though she could not resist adding that some people never truly change. Lydia Crane, by contrast, walked with a lighter step. Her reputation, so nearly ruined, had been restored, though she still bore the shadow of grief. She had admired Lionel Quarren with a young girl's intensity, and the knowledge of his fate could not easily be shaken. Yet there was a resilience in her eyes, as though she had glimpsed something of life's cruelty and resolved not to let it master her. Her father, Dr. Crane, softened in his manner, perhaps humbled by the knowledge that his severity had nearly blinded him to his daughter's innocence. The vicar and his wife busied themselves with the work of mending spirits. They organized a small memorial service for Lionel Quarren, modest but respectful. Few in the village had known him well, yet all attended. It was not only for the man himself, but for the sense of closure, the reassurance that order, though shaken, could be restored. Inspector Craddock remained in the village several days longer, ensuring that the evidence was firmly gathered. The poisoned cup was recovered from Mrs. Price Ridley's china set, its faint blue crest leaving no doubt. The missing vial was found, carefully hidden behind medical supplies in the surgery. and though Dr. Haydock made no confession, the weight of proof was plain. On his final evening, Craddock called at Miss Marple's cottage. He found her by the hearth, her needles moving in their unhurried rhythm, the fire casting a gentle glow upon her face. "You were right, as always," he said with a mixture of admiration and resignation. It was the small things that gave him away, the cup, the cuff, the look in his eyes. "I'd have missed half of it if not for you." Miss Marple smiled. "It is very kind of you to say so, Inspector." But truly, it was Lionel Quarren who saw, most clearly. He drew what people could not conceal, and for that he paid dearly. "I merely followed the trail he left behind." Craddock shook his head. "You make it sound simple, but it never is. I sometimes think you see human nature as a kind of open book." "Oh no," Miss Marple replied softly. "Not open. More like a book left in the sun, 2 long pages faded, corners torn, some lines missing. But if one reads carefully, the meaning is still there." The inspector chuckled, then grew serious. "It will go to trial, of course. The village will take years to forget." "They always do," Miss Marple said, folding her knitting. "But forgetting is not the same as healing. There will be whispers for months, perhaps years, and yet in time the lanes will be as quiet as before, the roses as bright, and the teacups filled once more. Such is the way of villages." After he left, Miss Marple sat a long while, her thoughts drifting. She felt no triumph, only the familiar melancholy that followed the solving of a crime. For each truth uncovered left behind a scared young girl's innocence wounded, a community's trust shaken, a life ended. 2 days later, she attended the memorial at the church. The villagers sat together in the pews, their heads bowed as the vicar spoke of art, of truth, and of the frailty of human pride. The organ played softly, its notes lingering in the rafters like unanswered questions. Miss Marple, her hands folded, reflected quietly. She thought of Lionel Quarren, so determined to capture reality on paper, and of the irony that his talent had revealed more than anyone wished to see. She thought of Dr. Haydock, once respected, undone by the very knowledge that had elevated him. And she thought of the village itself, where small secrets had grown like weeds until one man's pencil dragged them into the light. When the service ended, the congregation drifted out into the sunlight. Children ran across the grass, their laughter bright against the hush of the adults. Mrs. Bantry linked arms with Miss Marple and sighed. "Well, my dear, another dreadful business put to rest. I dare say we shall all sleep more easily now." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, dear, though I find one never truly sleeps easily when one has seen what people are capable of. It is the nature of life roses and nettles to grow together, and one must always take care where one sets one's hand." The weeks that followed gradually softened the memory. Gossip turned back to ordinary matters, the success of the vicarage jam stall, the arrival of a new gardener at the manor, the curious behavior of Mrs. Hartnell's cat. Yet beneath it all lingered the knowledge that beneath the village's quiet exterior, human passions had once again boiled over into crime. And in her cottage on the lane, Miss Marple continued her knitting, her eyes ever observant, her ears ever attentive. For she knew that wherever people gathered, whether in great cities or small villages, the same patterns of love, jealousy, pride, and fear repeated themselves endlessly. It was not triumph she felt, but acceptance. She had seen too often how frailty led to folly and folly to crime, yet she also knew that kindness, courage, and patience had their place too. It was this balance that kept the world turning, even in the smallest of villages. As the autumn leaves began to fall, St. Mary Mead settled once more into its rhythm, and Miss Marple, wise and watchful, remained its quiet guardian, knowing that though crimes may pass and scandals fade, the study of human nature never truly ends.